Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Institute for European Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Welcome to the third lecture evening in our series on EU energy policy on the road to decarbonisation. Those of you who attended the first two lecture evenings know that we have covered in the first lecture an introduction to the EU's energy policy acquis, and in the second lecture last week more the climate policy side of things. So today's topic is again in the decarbonisation perspective, decarbonisation by 2050, roadmaps and scenarios compared. I should mention as usual that the lecture series is organized in cooperation with WWF Climate Strategies and the Ecological Institute in Berlin, and that we have the support on the Jean Monnet Lifelong Learning Program of the European Commission, which we gratefully acknowledge. It's my pleasure to introduce two speakers for tonight who will talk on roadmaps and scenarios towards 2050 decarbonisation. The first one is Adam White of the WWF European Policy Office. So WWF, as I mentioned, is one of the co-coordinators, co-organizers of the lecture series. And the second one will be Stefan Lechtenböhmer of the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy, and he's the director of the research group Future Energy and Mobility Structures. Welcome to the IES. Perhaps just let's get started with Adam White. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Adam White. I'm from the WWF European Policy Office. I'm the project officer there, which means I'm responsible for commissioning external research primarily. It also means I don't have a specific policy expertise, so that's my initial excuse for not maybe being able to answer all your questions, but I'll certainly do my best. My apologies for the slide. It's I used the WWF font, which doesn't seem to translate very well to non-WWF computers, but that shouldn't cause too much of a problem, I hope, for the rest of the presentation. So as you can see, WWF has an energy vision, which is what I've been asked to present. This is it. It's a global vision, but then we're also translating that to a European level. And then I'll go into a bit about how this vision informs what we ask for from European and member state policymakers. So that is the report. The vision is 100% renewable energy by 2050. In terms of full disclosure, I should say that the scenario that this report represents, which was developed by Ecofis, actually reaches 95%. But the vision, that's using today's technologies, so the vision is for 100% with future developments and so on. But we can pin down 95% using what we know now, and the remaining 5%, which can often be the most difficult to achieve, would be dependent on future developments. Some of the reasons about why we need 100% renewable energy, I won't go into this in too much detail, I'm sure you all know, but just a couple of highlights. Obviously this year saw the greatest melt in Arctic ice cover. It was greater than the previous record by an area the size of more than Sweden and Finland, so it's a significant melt this year, which should obviously remind us of the urgency of addressing climate change. And on the other hand, if we achieve the EU's target for 20% energy efficiency and cut emissions by 30% instead of the target of 20%, that could create 8 million net jobs in the EU. So there are some serious reasons for transforming the energy system, both to protect the climate and for social benefits. These are some of the principal assumptions that lie behind the scenario. This is often the area in which most discussion happens, most disagreement can happen. So I'll move through it quite quickly, but if you want to ask me more questions on this at the end, feel free. Probably most interesting to note is that the scenario accepts business as usual projections for population growth, GDP, activity levels and fuel prices. But it changes business as usual projections for transport modal shift and also for diets. Like I said, I can go into that in some more detail in the Q&A session if people are particularly interested. Sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong thing. So, as I said, the global report is global. It uses 10 regions, but we are completing work more or less to translate the global vision to a European EU 27 level, which is what I will come to a bit later. This is how the scenario shows that the energy system will change or should change by 2050 over time. So here you see increasing amounts of renewable energy up to this point. You see decreasing amounts of fossil fuel energy, especially coal, and overall you see a reduction in energy demand. So that is the vision that WWF have: more renewables, less fossils, and less energy use overall. So more efficiency. This is a simplified version of that graph, just showing the steep decline in non-renewable energy use and a steep increase in renewable energy use and the overall reduction. This is what that means for CO2 emissions, which is obviously the core indicator that we have to be concerned about. You see a radical reduction in emissions from fossil fuels and nuclear, but also we have to take account of those CO2 emissions which do come from some renewable sources, particularly hydro and biomass. They are taken into account. Overall, the scenario achieves more than 80% emissions reductions. Obviously, the EU has a target of 80 to 95% emissions reductions. So, yeah, we wanted to be in line with that, but I think there's possibly scope to go further. So, having looked at the global level, this is how we're adapting this big report into a smaller report for the EU level. The starting point, obviously, the global report, and then we decided that in order to be sure that we were moving in the right direction, we would test the results of the global report, which started producing results from 2005-2010 against global progress, actual global progress. So we would have some confidence that the model was broadly working, at least in the initial years. We'd then refine it and then get the outputs, and then we decided to compare the report to other similar models, but Stefan has a much more comprehensive view of that, so I'll leave that section off to him. But this is basically the approach we took. So testing the model, we see that, so this is the EcoFIS model, EcoFIS did the work for us, and it's basically in line with IEA statistics. Total final consumption very similar, and so is renewable consumption, and the renewable share in the mix obviously identical. And then when we scale those results down to the EU level, again we get a pretty strong correlation. We were confident that, at least at the beginning, the scenario was working. These are some of the assumptions that had to be adapted for the EU context. The assumptions in the global report are basically either global assumptions or they're OECD country and non-OECD country assumptions. So there was pretty much, it was pretty similar when you were looking at OECD assumptions for the EU 27, but some of them had to be refined. Again, I'm happy to give some details on that if people are interested to see. But for now, we basically took into account some minor changes that would be needed to better reflect the EU context. So this is the graph for the EU in 2030, I should point out, not for 2050. It's the equivalent graph that you saw completed for the global report. I won't give absolute numbers at the moment because this work isn't completely completed, but I thought it would be nice to give you a representation of what we can see happening at the EU level. And again, pretty strong increase in renewables, pretty strong reduction in fossils, and achieving efficiency gains overall by 2030. So, what do these? Oh, I think. Yeah. Okay, I have some extra slides that I missed off, but that's fine. We look at what these results mean for the lobbying that WWF does at the EU level and also member states. And primarily that is concerned at the moment with the EU's Energy Roadmap 2050. And so we did a detailed study of what that roadmap really means. The Commission's communication, whilst informative, wasn't necessarily that digestible. So the first issue that we raised with it is whether it's really a comprehensive look at all the options. So this chart shows the primary energy demand by fuel in 2050. So it's what fuels we'll be using in 2050 if we follow any of the Commission's roadmaps. So there's high efficiency, diversified supply technologies, which is basically a mix, high renewables, which is like high efficiency, does what it says. It should be remembered that delayed CCS is actually high nuclear, and low nuclear is actually high CCS. So that is one of the concerns we have, that the very differentiating names of the energy roadmap don't really, could be slightly misleading, because there's not a radical difference between the different options, and there's obviously not a 100% renewables option in there. As a first step, we, along with a number of other key stakeholders, MEPs and so on, are at least calling for the Commission to produce a scenario which combines the efficiency gains of the high efficiency scenario, so this is obviously the lowest bar, with the renewable generation of the high renewables scenario to generate a larger share of renewables. At the moment, renewables is typically around 29 to 32% of total energy in 2030. This is obviously 2050 graph, but like 2030, which is important because that's the debate that is going on in the EU at the moment. What should be the should there be targets after 2020? What should they be? So we are trying to inform that debate by saying there's more options possible, basically. Within the detail of what the Commission's work tells us, one thing that we wanted to point out was the absolute paramount importance of achieving energy efficiency, energy savings, absolute savings. All of the Commission scenarios assume energy savings or achieve energy savings, but they don't discuss the risks of not doing so. So this graph is one example of what might happen if, in the Commission's assumptions, all of their biomass is used up by 2050. All of the sustainable available biomass is used in 2050. But if you don't achieve energy savings, obviously you start to run into problems. And this graph shows that if you compare the biomass production that the Commission envisages against energy use as is envisaged by the reference scenario, so without any further policy, then you start to run out of biomass in 2030. That generates significant problems, especially in the transport sector, where biomass is the key decarbonisation option. So we want to introduce this idea of a need for a greater understanding of the risks involved and the problems that you run into if you don't take that into account. I can come to that again in the discussion. So we think there needs to be much more renewables. Obviously we have a 100% renewable energy vision, and we think that there's a significant window of opportunity for delivering those renewable energies. These graphs show the total capacity of fossil fuels and nuclear over time. Anything built before 2005 or after 2050 is not included. So this is what is built during the roadmap lifetime. And it shows that there is a significant amount of both fossil fuel and nuclear power. If this capacity was delivered using renewables, there is clearly scope for doing much more. So there's, like we say, a big window of opportunity. The other issue that we want to make very clear is that there is strong talk about the importance of gas as a balancing and supporting generation technology to renewables. Renewables, obviously, there is a concern about variability of supply, and so gas is often held up as a way of mitigating that variability. The Commission's roadmap, so this is all on the Commission's work, this isn't our numbers at all, shows that the absolute use of gas over time in their scenarios is declining strongly. That's this left-hand graph. and the share of gas is basically stable. So the message that we're communicating there is that whilst the role of gas might become more important, that doesn't mean that you need more gas. And in fact, the Commission's telling us we need less gas. So that's the key message on gas, which is gaining a lot of ground in the Brussels debate at the moment. The final point is that it is using the scenarios that the Commission lays out. It's quite difficult to go further in key areas. So this circle shows the remaining carbon emissions by sector in 2050 if you've achieved the different Commission decarbonisation scenarios, and you can see that the bulk is in transport, that big orange section on the right, but there's also a significant amount in industry. The challenge in transport is that the Commission relies quite heavily on biofuels, but they use up all of the sustainable biofuel that is assumed to be available. So it's very hard to do more decarbonisation just by scaling up the amount of biofuels you use, because they assume there isn't any more. So we argue that it would be a safer option to go much earlier for electrification than to maintain this reliance on biofuels. Likewise, on industry, all of the sustainable, well, it's assumed that it would be prohibitively expensive to put more CCS in industrial sectors where it's not already placed in the scenarios. So there it's quite a difficult solution. I think we're looking at more efficiency and technological advances that aren't in place at the moment. They're not on the shelf ready to be used right now. So there are some examples of work that has identified those potential solutions, but they're difficult to realize. So overall, we're asking for the Commission to look at more ambitious options, because currently the 80 to 95% target is predicated on maintaining global warming at less than 2 degrees or less. But increasingly there's a debate that actually a lower level of temperature increase is going to be required. But the roadmap scenarios don't really allow for going further. So we're basically arguing that the Commission should build in more flexibility by developing scenarios that are more ambitious and less dependent on, for example, in transport biofuels. I think that's it for now, but like I said, there's more information if there's specific interest in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Quick overview of lots of complicated and intertwined, I guess, facts and figures. I hope we'll come back to some of those in the discussion. I guess it also already gets clear, even in the Commission scenarios, that whatever scenario you follow and whatever roadmap has tremendous implications of a political nature of, depending on whether you say 80 or 95, you will have to decarbonize different areas of energy policy depending on what the technologies are that you foresee, etc. We can come back to that, I think, in the discussion. But I would like to hand the floor now to Stefan Lechtenböhmer and the Wuppertal Institute, together with others. I think the Öko Institute in Berlin has done actually a comparative study, I think, on looking at different scenarios in the power sector, and that, I believe, will be the major point of your presentation. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the possibility to present some core results of our study that we made on behalf of CEFEP, an NGO working on energy transformation in Europe. We did this study, as already mentioned, by Sebastian Oberthür, together with the Eco Institute in Berlin. And it's a meta-study on the electricity sector. And we analyzed a couple of recent studies that had been presented since 2009 on the power sector, and more particularly on decarbonization of the power sector. Here is an overview of the studies. It's 4 studies, one by Euroelectric, the Association of European Electricity Producers, one by Greenpeace and EREC, the Association of Renewable Energy, producers, one by European Climate Foundation, another NGO, and the studies by the European Commissions on the low carbon economy roadmap. So 4 studies by very different stakeholders, all targeting at decarbonizing the electricity system. And so you can see here all of these 9 scenarios, which are in total in these 4 studies, go for very low CO2 emissions in the European power sector. On average, the reduction is 99% in all the scenarios. So that's a common target between all the scenarios. Maybe one word in advance, why did we concentrate on studies on the electricity system? Because electricity system is only a part of the energy system. Is only emitting a part of our CO2, of course. But the electricity system is a crucial part of the energy system because it is very much interlinked. You cannot, you have a system which has to deliver electricity at every minute, at every second. The same amount of electricity that is used has to be produced. So you have to have a connection with grids, etc. You need power plants. I won't explain that in detail, but the system is very much interlinked and is more complicated, or every system, every subsystem of the energy system has its own complications, but this system is very much interlinked and complicated to decarbonize. That's one of the issues. Another point that we already had in the presentation before, this sector is going to be reinvested now. The European electricity systems have been constructed and developed over the last century, and now a huge share of those is coming into age, so they have to be reinvested. That forms a sort of window of opportunity. And if we reinvest here in conventional technology, in fossil technology, we will produce lock-in situations because electricity grids, power plants are all long-living infrastructure investments with typical lifetimes of 30, 40, 50 and even more years. So we are going to cement structures if we do not, if we are not very fast here in this system. Another argument to take a very close look on the electricity system. And of course, a third argument, the electricity system is currently believed to be a sort of forerunner in decarbonization. Although it's a complicated system, not very simple, we currently see a couple of options to decarbonize the electricity system, and even some more than in other sectors. We already had from Adam a slide that showed in the end, in 2050, we will remain in transport sector and industry with the rest of CO2. Electricity system, basically no CO2 remains. So that's the last argument why there is so much emphasis on the electricity system, because we see this as a system that can or could be capable of coming really down to something close to zero, which is much more difficult to imagine, for example, in the transport sector. And what is more, and you cannot see in this slide, is that the electricity system is even believed to export decarbonization into other sectors like housing, like industry, like transport sector. I will come to this later. So these are the arguments why we concentrated on these studies on the electricity system. That does not mean that we do not have to solve also all the problems in the other sectors, but this is a very crucial field, and we can gain a lot if we succeed here in decarbonization. One word to the methodology. We prepared a meta study, and this meta study was not only about comparing these 4 studies and 9 scenarios, but we also tried to develop a methodology that helps to better understand different future studies. We have a couple of studies available, and fortunately there are even coming more, and more stakeholders are trying to bring their own view into the debate about our energy future. But it's always very difficult to understand difficult scenarios, different studies, different works, because it's not all presented in the same way, for example. On the for you, it's on the left side, you can see what the studies provide. Typically, they provide inputs, data, assumptions, etc. They have certain methodologies, sometimes comparable, sometimes different, and they have results. But not all these results, for example, are presented in the same way, or not all studies have the same results. So we developed a sort of data roster, a roster in order to make them more comparable, in order to really see what does this study mean and what does this study mean. Because presentation of the study is often customized on what they want to say. So they have a certain focus on certain arguments. And with this data roster, we tried to make them really comparable. And that was quite a bit of work for my colleagues mainly to put that together. And of course, that needed also a lot of gap filling, because much of the data that we needed to really compare was not available in the studies. For different reasons. Sometimes they do not want to disclose these data, and in other reasons they just didn't, because they didn't know that somebody would be interested. A couple of reasons, but it of course was a major work for us in this meta-study to bring all these studies into a format that we really could analytically compare them. We used an analysis tool for that, which I will not present here in detail, but is available in the internet. And then come to a comparison of explicit and also implicit information in this study. And the targets of this are, of course, to get a transparency of the modeling exercises, to really have them clear what they did, what were their results, what were their results in comparison to other studies, to other scenarios, and of course, a better understanding in the end of the issues at stake. Regarding our future and regarding the answers or the contributions that different modeling exercises can do for this. For this we developed this data raster. It's only a part of this. It's downloadable in the internet. We used it as a tool in this project, and it has been decided by CEFEP to use this as a standard for the documentation of future studies by them, and I hope also others take this up. Eurelectric, for example, also indicated that they are trying to use this roster, and I hope WWF will also use that in order to simplify comparison for the future and simplify future meta-analysis of study. We think that this is also an important step in enabling better and more informed discussions about the real issues these future studies get, and not on what is really in the study, because that should be transparent and not so needed to be discussed or even debated. So back to our analysis, the four studies that we analyzed have in a total 9 scenarios. Eurelectric only has one scenario, and we have sorted them according to a couple of core technologies. Scenario philosophies are different by the different studies. Eurelectric wanted to find a cost-effective pathway to decarbonization. So that's the electricity industry's view. Greenpeace wanted to show that deep CO2 reductions are possible, so it's more a feasibility approach. ECF wanted to have a practical, independent and objective analysis. I think their target was mainly to draw different stakeholders together, and they presented the widest range of scenarios, more or less prototypical scenarios for every possible energy future or electricity future. And the European Commission, of course, wanted to explore different pathways of the energy system. They have, with 5 scenarios, the most scenarios, and of course they had to give answers to the very much questions and to reflect also the very different ideas which exist in Europe, in the member states, on decarbonization of electricity systems. And below you can see what they did, for example, with CCS, which is very pronounced in the Euroelectric study, but not in Greenpeace. The Commission is something in between some CCS in some scenarios and no CCS in others. The same for nuclear, a little bit parallel to the CCS. The next issue is on modeling. Is the supply mix predetermined in these scenarios, or is it somehow modeled? The Euroelectric uses an optimization approach. Greenpeace has an implicit predetermination. ECF does it explicitly. They really want to know what comes out if we follow certain pathways. And the European Commission again uses a sort of mixed way. With regards to the models or general approaches used, they are relatively similar. It are electricity system models which are comparable. The Euroelectric and the European Commission both use the PRIMES model by the University of Athens, which combines a simulation with a partial equilibrium model focusing on certain interactions in the electricity markets. The Greenpeace study uses a simulation model with a more normative approach, less economic optimization, and ECF uses a detailed power sector simulation model, but different from PRIMES. I think it was by McKinsey. So now to the results from our meta-study from the comparison of all these scenarios. And I want to first highlight the electricity demand side, which is not really highlighted in the studies, so it's rather outside of them. But I think with regards to the consequences of what these studies model, it's very important and crucial to highlight the electricity demand. And you can see here on the left different reference scenarios which expect increasing electricity demand in the European Union by about 50% until 2050. And then you can see all the decarbonization scenarios, and they are more or less around zero. So that means all these decarbonization scenarios mainly implicitly assume very stringent energy efficiency measures. They assume that these business as usual electricity demand growth in traditional electricity uses can be completely saved by electricity efficiency policies and measures, which have to be implemented still. But that is a very significant assumption that this 50% increase in electricity demand can be saved. But with regards to total electricity demand, the picture is quite different, because on top of these savings there comes new electricity demand. We had quite a lot of difficulties to figure that out. So this is here only additional electricity demand in the transport sector. Transport currently uses very little amount of electricity, but in the future that will be different. So all the savings, basically, or a large share of the savings, will be compensated for by new electricity uses, mainly electric mobility in individual transport, which is one of the fields where these scenarios assume that the electricity sector will export decarbonization, because it can provide, or it could provide in these scenarios, low carbon or zero carbon electricity to cars, for example. There are other fields which are cannot be so easily identified in the numbers available. This is, for example, the heating systems could be switched on heat pumps that, for example, can use electricity. It's also a way of using low carbon or zero carbon electricity to the heating segment, exporting it, and of course also in industry there are potential conversions of processes into using more electricity. instead of direct use of fossil fuels, which is also a field of decarbonization via the electricity system. In the end, that means the studies see an increasing use of electricity, but not due to increases in traditional demands, but due to new demands which are used for decarbonization. That is, of course, a uniform idea of all the studies. It's most pronounced in the Euroelectric study, of course, that's clear. They want to stay in the business, do not give up their growth perspectives. So for them it's quite understandable why they project it. But basically, due to the other reasons, also the other studies more or less intensively are assuming the same strategy, so to say, export electricity. But that is only possible if we are successful in saving electricity, and that's also in Euroelectric. Now let's switch to the supply side. And on the supply side, here we have a huge range of the scenarios. I will give you an explanation of what that means. We basically can see three different worlds in the scenarios. The first world is the 32 to 42% renewable electricity world in 2050. This world is basically means that we do not have climate policy. This is basically the reference or business as usual scenarios, or that we have very high shares of nuclear energy and fossil energy with carbon capture and storage together. So, which is only in one scenario. So that is basically a no climate policy world. Then we have another one, in contrary, that's the 80 to 98% renewable electricity world. So that's the renewable path. And a couple of studies and scenarios from all the studies go into this world. They assume that we will basically convert our electricity system over the next 40 years into a more or less full renewable system. And of course there's a couple of challenges linked to that. Particularly we need to cover, to get along with this increased fluctuation of the production, because huge share of this is wind and solar, which have natural fluctuation in production of electricity, and of course we have to work with this. That means that we need to expand the grids, etc., that we need storage and these things. Very significant and high challenges, but very clear that we need to overcome these challenges to get into this renewable electricity world. And then we have the third one. That's somehow intermediate. Intermediate because it's between the two of those. But if you go into the shares, it even has 2/3 of the electricity in the end by renewable energies. And that means basically that this third world has the same challenges than the green world. We need to cover flexibility, we need to cover exchange, storage, etc. Plus the challenges that nuclear expansion and CCS expansion deliver to us. So it adds somehow the challenges for these strategies to each other. I can go a bit more into detail. Here you see the scenarios and their shares in 2050 of electricity. And here again you see the scenarios with 40% renewables, then those with 2/3 of renewables, and those the mainly renewable scenarios. And in the end, you can also see that fossil fuels, our dominant electricity today, will not play a role in the future in 2050. Unabated fossil fuels is only minor in a very small number of scenarios. In fact, what is not renewable comes from CCS and nuclear in different shares, typically 50-50 in most of the scenarios. The Greenpeace scenarios here are a little bit particular because they assume import of renewable energies from outside the European Union. So that's a bit specific, but the other scenarios are often not explicit on this. And if we go into detail, what renewable energy carriers do these scenarios assume, then we can see again here the bulk of renewable electricity will be from wind, onshore and offshore. We did not divide between them because we did not have enough data for that. So wind will deliver the bulk of renewable electricity. The shares of hydro are in generally relatively constant and not far from current values because hydro energy is more or less exploited in the European Union. Biomass is also, apart from some exemptions, relatively equal in all the scenarios, but the difference will be made up from solar. So solar is particularly in the 80% scenarios also very significant. Let's go to one underlying assumption which is very important and will be important for the future as well. Of course, these differences also are driven by assumptions in the studies. And here we have photovoltaic, which is most pronounced to show difference between studies. We see here the EU starts with relatively high prices but assumes that until 2050 photovoltaic electricity generation can become much cheaper. Euroelectric is more optimistic on the start, but not so optimistic on the decline, and the others are somewhat similar but only lower. But if we go into reality, we see that in 2010 we were really here where those studies started, but already in 2012 we were below the value that Euroelectric assumes for 2050, and in a range that the other studies have between 2020 and 2030. And we do not know where photovoltaic will be next year or in 2015. So there is an effect that we see that is not incorporated in all the scenarios. I saw the figure from WWF and I looked on that, and that was already interestingly for 2030 showing as much photovoltaics as onshore wind. So interesting, but maybe we will see some differences in reality as compared with these scenarios show here. And particularly the price development in photovoltaic is not yet incorporated in these studies and will provide some surprises compared to what we see there. So let me conclude what we find out from these studies. First of all, if we look at all these studies, they show relatively similar targets. Of course, that's clear because they have the same assumption. But they also show a couple of very robust key areas where we do need political action in the European Union if we want to get somehow near to a decarbonized electricity system. And this is not always explicitly made in the studies, but if you really look behind what they assume, what they calculate, it's relatively robust. We see, first of all, decarbonizing electricity is a core strategy. It can deliver very high CO2 reductions in the electricity sector, and if we are successful in energy efficiency, it can also export CO2 reductions into other sectors. That's clear, that's shown by all the scenarios, so the feasibility seems to be there. With regards to the costs, it was very difficult. It is even more difficult to analyze the scenarios on the issue of costs. But more or less, they also agree that we can pay for it. That is basically we have to pay. We have to invest in different things, but we have to invest in the electricity system anyway. So results for policy are first that demand-side efficiency gains are crucial in all decarbonization scenarios, and that means that we have to significantly strengthen energy efficiency policy on electricity savings, demand-side electricity savings, which is a field where much stronger policy is needed, and the Energy Efficiency Directive is probably a first step into that direction, but for sure not enough to achieve what these scenarios assume. Another thing, there is no room for unabated fossil fuel generation by 2050 and even much earlier. That means basically that there should be no new investment into fossil-fired electricity generation. Maybe apart from some CHP, gas-fired CHP, or some turbines for reserve power. But apart from these very limited exemptions, all these scenarios basically show that we will not end up in a decarbonized electricity system if we do invest in conventional fossil fuels in the next years. The renewable energies are the backbone for decarbonization electricity anyway. Regardless which philosophy for decarbonization the scenario follows, the renewable energies are the backbone. They are delivering the major share of the future electricity, and particularly of the future low carbon electricity. So enabling this conversion to a renewable energy electricity system is the core strategy. That means that improving the grids is a major challenge. Improving the interconnections between the different countries of the EU is a major policy, which is also in line with other European policy targets and should therefore be very important. It is, of course, for example, very interesting that in Germany there are several hours in the year where there is no sun shining and no wind blowing, and where there is really a problem with these two energy carriers. But if you could have a strong enough electricity system which extends over the whole European Union, there is basically about an hour a year where the wind is blowing nowhere, not more. So geographical distance is very important here, and if it's possible to strengthen electricity connection, that would be an important, important contribution to a solution to a renewable electricity system. So that's very important, and of course also development of storage is the next policy that is also additionally needed, additional to the investment into the renewable generation. And the last point, the respective roles of CCS and nuclear as the other low carbon or zero carbon options are relatively uncertain. It's relatively unclear which role they will play. The scenarios differ, but they have more or less in most scenarios a secondary role apart from one. And it's of course really a question whether it's worth to tackle also their problems, which are again in the same size of amount of complicity than the renewable electricity, and have to be solved in addition if we are going for a combination. And that adds to the problem that renewable fluctuating generation is not really very much feasible in the market regime with base load oriented low carbon technologies such as nuclear and CCS, which need to run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, at least for economic reasons, because of their very high capital costs. So that's really an open question, and leads me to the conclusion that really the enabling of the renewable energies as electricity generation technology should be the main priority, and is probably will turn out in the end as the most robust strategy for the decarbonized electricity system. Thanks a lot. And of course, you can read. I heard you. You can get the study, which has a lot of policy papers going with us on our website and also on the CEPAC website. I provided the links there on the slides. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was a great overview. I thought pointing to several of the interconnections with the transport and the heating sector, etc. And we'll see. Next week we'll focus on the power sector once more, and we'll see what Euroelectric has to say about CCS and nuclear. With that, perhaps we can open the floor for discussion. Obviously, there are various technical issues concerned policy issues. I don't think I'll try to structure the debate in any sense, but just open the floor for all those kinds of questions. It's, I guess, technically challenging, all this modeling work and scenario work. But as you can see, I think a figure from also was very well pointed out by Stefan. I thought kind of the implications is clear of what you model and where you're going, what you need to do, and what the policy implications are of that. Can I just ask you, who wants to have the floor over there, if you could always identify yourself and then.
Thanks, Chair. I'm very happy to attend the lectures. I am Zhang from Institute of European Studies, Chinese and Social Science. I just came here yesterday and was invited by the physics as a visiting scholar. I'm very interested in the two presentations, and it seems that in China all of our researchers will notice that Europe will we speed up the road to low carbon economics. So decarbonization is very important steps to realize the aims. So, but for me, I have some wonders. I'm afraid it's possible for realize the ideal scenario to in 2050. It means that European Commission will reach the aims for the at that year. The renewable energy will be about 100 or almost 100% of total energy mix. My wonder is, it's possible to realize it, because now, just Professor mentioned, it should be in reinvestment of energy sector. Now Europeans suffer a huge euro debt crisis. How did you get the money or with financial resources to reinvestment the energy sector? And also, we know EU is not a superpower, it's not one country. It's made of 27 or more countries, EU member states. So they are different. They are in the different economic stages. Maybe some of advanced countries, in Nordic countries or Germany, would like to reinvestment energy policy and push the decarbonization process. But some, maybe, for example, the Greece, Spain or Portugal, they don't like to they don't like push the decarbonization policy. So how did you realize the targets in the 2050? Thanks.
Thank you. Who else wants to take the floor? There are two over there, and we can take these two, I think, one after the other.
My name is Georges Deschamps. I'm from the European Commission, Research and Innovation. I have two questions, one to Adam White and one for both. The first relates to the high renewable energy scenarios you mentioned, which I think about 50% renewables by 2050, or was it higher share of the total energy?
So the WWF
Yeah.
is 100% renewable by
100%.
by 2050.
So that was probably the 2030 slide.
2030 is
2030 was a bit less.
It's less.
Okay. So my question was, technically, the most renewables, at least PV and wind and biomass also, are fairly mature, technically speaking. So what are the barriers for not having faster dissemination of these renewables and not achieving a higher share area? So that's the first question. The second question is also, I think I was very interested in the scenario, the examination and analysis of the scenarios. What I missed is the different parts, the different types of renewables that are involved in those scenarios, because not every renewable has the same carbon impact on the environment. Most energy is produced by biomass for heat, and we know that biomass has a higher carbon footprint than other renewables. I wanted to know how you can distinguish in the scenarios what is the share of biomass in the renewables. I think I would like you to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Is Claire over there?
My name is Lechtenböhmer. I'm a researcher from the Institute for European Studies. So first, many thanks to the speakers for the interesting and very comprehensive presentations. My question concerns taking into consideration that the decisions about the energy mix and nuclear energy are mostly national competence. To what extent do the existing scenarios take into account also national strategies and also national scenarios for the different energy mix and different renewable energy sources? This is the first question. And the second question is also relates to the first one. What should be then the level of governance required for this in terms of regional, national, European? And then what should be also the different roles and contributions of the public and private sector regarding to investments? So there are many open questions that the energy roadmap leaves. Should, for example, low carbon technology be subsidized until they become cost competitive? And how long? Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Claire Dupont from the Institute for European Studies. I actually have two questions as well, just to
We have some time.
The first was directly to Adam. Your graph showing the 2030 shares of energy. I was wondering if you could maybe at least give the figure for the percentage of renewable energy sources that you see there, because you didn't give the figures precisely, but just in addition, this is something that's under discussion in terms of policy. Do we need a target for 2030? What should that be? And if you have from WWF a particular angle on that, that would be interesting. And my second question relates to gas for both speakers. So, Adam, you mentioned, of course, that we need less gas in the future. You also discussed the idea of nobody gets infrastructure, and then later, Stefan, you described how we just cannot invest in any more fossil fuel-generated electricity. And a lot of the discussion about gas is that it can provide less carbon emission generated fuel or energy. So, for example, we just close a few coal plants and gas might replace that, or as a backup for renewable energies. So I'm just wondering, with these sort of nuances present in your scenario analysis, and also for Adam, does this nuance come up in WWF's interest in countering the promotion of gas in policies?
Thanks a lot. I think we'll go back to the speakers to try, and I'll try to see that you actually respond, or otherwise remind you of the questions. It's also clear to everybody, and perhaps it's important to point that out also in your responses, perhaps, that I think your study is broader and that covers the whole energy sector. Frequently we think the energy sector is the power sector, but then the power sector is only part of energy. We have heating, we have transport in the broader. And I think also to relate that to broader decarbonization scenarios, and that's probably the rationale for going 100% renewable for the overall energy sector. And I think that we heard in the past weeks that if we want to, looking at Europe, if we want to get to 80 to 95%, agriculture, I think at the moment alone accounts for like 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. So you do need to completely decarbonize the energy sector, broader energy sector for that. Just want to bring that in the debate and also make sure that everybody understands that the two scenario works are covering have different scope. Please, Adam, perhaps I can first go to you.
Perfect. So, thank you for your questions. My first answer was exactly that there is a difference between the whole energy sector and the electricity sector as a part of that. It's much, well, relatively speaking, more likely or easier to completely decarbonize the electricity supply than it is the whole energy sector. So that's, I think that's the first distinction to draw. I think I would challenge the basis of the question that it's going to cost more money to go down a higher renewables pathway. Obviously, the relative costs depend, for example, on the future development of fossil fuel costs. That will have a big impact on the overall economic view of these decarbonization scenarios. If fossil fuel prices start to rocket up, then it becomes much cheaper to go down a renewables pathway, and vice versa is also true. But there are definite benefits. I mentioned 8 million new jobs for increasing climate ambition in Europe. So you should look at both sides, not just the cost but also the benefits. And I think those who argue that transforming the energy system in the way that we both laid out is going to slow down competition and cost an unacceptable amount of money in the current context are failing to really look at the overall picture and to see the benefits that are available. In answer to your questions, the limit on the amount of renewables in 2030 in the EU, one of the most significant caps is the amount of variable supply that is accepted into the electricity system. That is capped in our scenario at 45%. Even accepting that level of variability would require a significant amount of investment. You could potentially go further, but it would require more investment in order to do so. I'm not sure if Stefan might have some information about where other scenarios cap that variability level, but that's one of the significant limiting factors. You asked about biomass. The types of biomass are broken down in those colourful lines that I'll get to in Claire's question as well. But it's important to note that all the biomass used in our scenario complies with very strict sustainability criteria, and also that it is the last renewable energy resource that's called upon. So all the other sources are used first, and then biomass is used if required, if it can't be replaced elsewhere. Typically, the example used is in long-distance transport fuels like shipping. It's very hard to find an electricity solution to that, for example. In terms of competences, who should be doing this? Who should be legislating for this? Well, it is a current debate that is going on, and the WWF is very strongly involved in, because it is often said that energy is a national competence. Well, it is and it isn't. the energy mix is a national competence, but only in so much as the member states are complying with other parts of EU legislation, such as environmental legislation and single market legislation and so on. Also, it should be remembered that the EU policies in energy are decided as qualified majority decisions. So no single state should be able to block the development of energy policy in Europe. We've seen recently that a particular member state has been doing so on the development of these roadmaps, in both the low carbon roadmap and the energy roadmap. And WWF is arguing strongly that this is on the basis, I don't want to get too, this is the Institute of European Studies, you probably know more than me about it, but at the moment, when the European Council discusses things, they generate either presidency conclusions, which is if there is a general discussion but not all member states agree, or council conclusions, which are if everybody agrees with the conclusions of the meeting. And obviously council conclusions carry significantly more weight. This means that basically if one country disagrees, you can't issue council conclusions, you can only issue presidency conclusions, even in areas of EU policy where the final decision is on qualified majority. So WWF is starting to argue more and more that where the final decision is taken by qualified majority, council conclusions, which obviously carry that political weight, should also be agreed by qualified majority, not by unanimity. So that's something that we're working on, basically. Who should pay, public or private? I think, obviously, private companies and utilities are going to have a huge role to play, but I think it shouldn't be forgotten that decarbonising the energy system, keeping climate change in check, and cleaning up the air is a public good. And there is some public benefit to it, and therefore some public investment should probably be involved as well. That's certainly my personal view, and it's also the view of WWF, that these technologies need to be supported. They're doing an important role for all of us for the long term, and it's important that they are supported. Public support goes into a huge number of technologies, not just ones that generate an obvious public good like renewable energy. So I think to argue against support for renewables is flawed, basically. And the answer on the graph, I can say that for the EU 27 in 2030, the scenario has generated a number of 41% for the renewable energy share. That is based on energy efficiency gains that are higher than we've seen in comparable studies. So we're very heavy on the energy efficiency side. Within that 41%, around 19% is from sustainable biomass. So that's where it's moving to. That's also basically in line with other reports. On the whether gas is the answer, I think an important thing to look at is the developments in the United States, where gas has been, the development of shale gas has pushed down the price of gas so far that it's displaced coal from the energy generation mix, which means that the US's emissions are falling from electricity generation. But that's only up to a point, because gas will obviously produce emissions. So it's more of a short-term answer. Also, it should be remembered that coal that's not being burnt in the States is coming to Europe to be burnt here. So when you're taking a global view, yes, gas could replace coal in the short term, but there are knock-on effects that need to be taken into account. And it's really more of a short-term answer. Gas is a kind of reserve power, which is what I think we see in the Greenpeace scenario, is potentially more interesting for the long term, but it's really a very small proportion. Everything else has to be done more or less with renewables.
Thanks. Perhaps you want to go through the list as well?
I can also give some answers on the question. Of course, again, as an introduction, on a more narrow view on the electricity system of the EU, which is only part of the whole, but also very interesting. So first was the question on economic issues and on how can we finance that. Adam already said a couple of things on that, but I would really like to say that the studies very much agree that it will not cost more to go into a renewable energy system. We have to do lots of reinvestment anyway, and that's not exactly the same, but it's both. It's in the electricity system as a narrow system and in the overall energy system as well. But if we talk of the electricity system, the existing power plant network, power plant system will be or has to be replaced over the next 40 years, more or less completely. So we need investment into new power generation technology. The question is only into which. We will also need significant adaptation in the electricity grid. There will be higher costs probably with a renewable electricity system, but it's not the largest share of the overall investment. So the studies very much agree, and also taking into account that the fossil energy will become more expensive, that it really there is no significant cost difference between both ways that we can take. There may be a difference in what do we have to pay for. So the factor that we have to invest first and get the gains later is more pronounced in a way if we go for a renewable electricity system. So we have to invest a lot now. That may be a problem. You pointed out the current economic crisis, but could be also a solution to the crisis. I mean, Germany is maybe not the best example, but the one I know best. When Germany has had a couple of success with this investment, because that created jobs. This investment is very much on technology that is produced in the European Union, which is green technology, which is currently, so it's basically one of the core businesses that are currently believed to be strong future growth areas. So that's quite an interesting field to invest in and produce jobs, and where Europe has a lot of domestic technology, domestic jobs, domestic value chains, etc. So it's quite an interesting field to use also as a policy for recovery. So there is a potential win-win in this. I fully agree that this is not simple, not as simple as I can tell it here, but it's a very promising field, and economic recovery will not be simple anyway. That is a field that Europe should use for also not only for decarbonization of the electricity system, but also for regaining economic prospects. Of course, you mentioned there are countries that are weaker than others and will have more problems. That's also for sure true. But particularly in the southern countries, there are also good prospects for that. So natural conditions are not so bad. So for these countries, there is a lot of promising stories in the renewable electricity system idea. Of course, you have to mobilize investment. Therefore, maybe the eastern countries, so Poland and other countries, have a bit more difficult situation with regards to go to renewable electricity. So I would even see main problems there. That relates to another question. Yes, these studies that we have are not very much detailed with regards to national situations, with regards to national policies. So they should be improved there, because of course that is important, what strategies in different countries are followed. But when we come back to how to finance that, how to pay for that, we need of course public support, but there is a lot of private money available. Studies analyzing this say the money is there. In fact, due to economic crisis, there's a lot of money private money that is looking for the right investment. So it's important, of course, that policy sets the right direction, because investment is all about trust into the future and stable conditions. So here is a big challenge and a big chance, because if a stable pathway into decarbonizing electricity system is set, there comes a lot of private investment into play. And I guess also in economically weaker countries, there is room for private investment. We have the examples from Germany that all Germany's current electric power system, the fossil and nuclear power plants, are owned by 4 companies. 4 big companies have 85% of electric power. If you now go into the renewable electricity, which is already more than 60% of the conventional system in terms of electric power, only 4% of this is owned by these big 4 companies. The rest is very much varied by private persons, by farmers, by other companies. So the German renewable electricity that is now really strongly increasing is mainly investment from other people, and it's mainly investment from private money. Of course, that needed public support, but over the long term, this will pay back. So I think there is, if we go into a credible direction, if we have a good view where we are going to go, there will be finance for the investment, and a main share of that will come from private money. The question on biomass, I just presented electricity scenarios. Biomass has a minor share, less than 10% in the electricity system. That is, of course, mainly due to the fact that most scenarios acknowledge that biomass should be diverted into directions where you really do not have any other chances. And of course, biomass is more tricky. You already mentioned, has higher greenhouse gas effects, and also we all know that there are a couple of other problems linked to bioenergy, which makes it not such an easy strategy. And there, I think on the long term, we have to go much more into bioeconomy. But we need to have a biomass cascades. We have food biomass, which we need, of course, and there, biomass has also lots of material issues. We could use it first as a material and then as an energy carrier. So there's a lot of things to do, particularly here. And in this context, it plays an important role. But I agree to the scenario that in the electricity system, as a part of the overall system, it should play a limited role. That's mainly from my side on the bioenergy. And one last point on the gas. Gas is really an interesting question. I think the exemption that I mentioned in the electricity scenarios is mainly about gas. So a couple of the scenarios still have some gas. That is either for merely reserve power, which in the end doesn't consume very much gas, but invests some gas turbines, which then only are needed some 100 hours a year. It has the CHP, and some of the studies, those who go into the CCS, in the carbon capture and storage strategy, in the end, most of them have more gas with CCS than coal with CCS. And that is, of course, depends on the assumptions on costs, on CO2 prices, but also on a very simple discussion. When you see that in many places there's a limitation in the storage capacity for this CO2. And then is, of course, the question, why you use the technology which really dumps your storage capacity, which produces most CO2 for least electricity, which is coal. It might be a better idea to use carbon capture and storage with industrial processes or with gas. and a couple of these studies use gas for the remaining, as a significant share of the remaining fossil fuels. So that's a sort of assumption to what I said with regards to gas. However, the point Adam made is quite correct, I think. We have seen it in the German discussion, again, gas industry, and we are working a lot with them, always thought that they are the bridge to sustainability. And when the government came out with, in 2010, with the energy concept, with the decarbonisation, gas industry found out that they were not in the picture. And they were very much annoyed about that, because it was really that effect that the share of gas gradually declined, savings in the traditional markets, and not so much gains in new markets, which would be basically electricity. And they saw a problem for them. They are trying to do their own scenarios now and find out what could be their role in the future. Because it's not so easy just to say, okay, be cautious with new gas infrastructure. Of course, maybe we do not need too much more of that. But on the other hand, of course, we still need the gas industry for a certain long time as a player, because gas is the cleanest fossil fuel, definitely, and it's much cleaner than coal. And we need the gas industry, and we need, of course, provide them a sort of business case that is viable. And if all these infrastructures that they already have are not used anymore, or not used enough anymore, of course, they will get into economic problems, and we won't have them as a player. So this is a tricky issue in a transition phase. The ideas how gas could contribute are, for example, that the gas infrastructure and gas system has huge storage capacity. You can produce hydrogen from excess electricity and just inject it in the gas system. And up to, say, 5 to 10% hydrogen is easily absorbable by this system. And you can even, which of course produces losses, make methane out of that and store and inject that in the gas system. And alone the German natural gas system has storage capacity for the whole electricity consumption of a year. That's the situation in Germany. So there is, in principle, technically, huge of storage capacity in the gas system, which could play a role in the conversion via hydrogen, for example, or via methanization. Other fields are the biomass. If we produce biogas, and biogas is produced mainly not from the crops, but from the whole plant, so it's already more sustainable than fuels from biomass, from bioenergy. So the gas system could be also one of the routes to bring bioenergy into the energy system, into a heating system. There's also very efficient electricity CHP heat pumps, which could be fueled by biogas, biomethane, or blends of natural gas and biogenic gases, which is currently also already done. But it's of course also, again, a question of prices, etc. But that would be another route of having gas as a bridge to a low carbon or decarbonized energy system. And I think it's very important to follow up these routes and these ideas as well very seriously, because otherwise we might run into problems with the gas system, and we might lose it too early.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. I see Kevin.
Thank you. Kevin Layden. I won't be around when these scenarios work out. You guys will. But I want to draw on the experience I had as head of analysis and the Energy Director General of the Commission for 17 years or so, plus the fact that I was an advisor during the Convention on the Future of Europe to John Bruton. and he introduced an energy article in the Brazilian in May 2003. It stayed on the table 3 hours. It was just rejected. At this point in time, the member states were clearly making their views felt. It was 2 major states made it very clear that they were not ready to do it. A few years later, in the IGC, an article did come in. Now, Adam's ambition to use the Article 194 or subsequent to impose on member states centralized thinking, by carefully look at the experience during the Energy Efficiency Directive, a very ambitious, complicated attempt to micromanage energy efficiency. In passing, they couldn't decide whether it was in the energy saving business or the energy efficiency business, something which still escapes some of my former colleagues in understanding the difference between those two. But the key message that came out: the Commission proposes, the Parliament expands on it, and the Council resists. And we risked losing, on first reading, the Energy Efficiency Directive, except for the really heroic work of the Danish presidency to get a compromise document there. Now, I make that point there because if you think you're coming down that road, it's a dangerous one. The article itself leaves to the member states the final decisions on the structure of its energy supply. That has been uninterpreted yet by the Court of Justice. I think people will be very careful to go to the court on that one, because if it comes down 20% renewables, you may get away with 60% renewable directive from Brussels may trigger a more fundamental retention of power to the member states. So it's not a route one should really look at, and I think we should look very much at the issues, the economic issues. And one of the questions I'd just like to ask you, in terms of impact on the political economy of increasing electricity costs so substantially, at a time in austerity when in fact we are moving towards low cost and deflation, the impact, the political impact may be beyond what we think at the moment, because it won't be on a rising market, it'll be on a declining market, and therefore the impact on households, on industry, will be very, very substantial. Have you factored that into your analysis? The feedback from the energy into the economy again. I really do think that has been unexplored and may, in fact, fail to give us a practical way forward to gain consensus for the very important issues that have to take place now. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I've done much too long.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, then we... Was that? Yes, please. Follow up.
An additional question on gas. Do these scenarios take into account a different type of gas or oil it's extracted from? I'm thinking of new types of gas from shale and tar sands and so on. Does that affect the scenarios or not?
Anyone else that will be the last call? Okay, I think Kevin very much identified and I'm eager to hear the speakers on that, the main challenge that somehow seems to be out there, and that is we have all these nice scenarios on where we should go, and that was pointed out before, I think, and then the politics come in, and the current political climate, even if in the long term the investments pay off, etc., who's going to do the investments now and going to politically intervene to make the investments happen now? So that's why you have your own microphones. Adam first, and then we have the gas question.
So yeah, it's a very pertinent question. I think the first thing that really caught me was that we're not seeking to impose anything. We're simply, the argument we're making is that at all stages of the political debate on these issues, the principle of qualified majority voting should be applied. That might mean that some states are doing things they don't want to do, but that would exist at the final decision anyway. Simply bringing that a bit further forward. It's extremely true that the Energy Efficiency Directive was very, very difficult to negotiate. I sit opposite the policy officer on this, and I can tell you she didn't have much fun whilst that was going on. It was a tangled web. It was very interesting to see that some of those states that were most resistant to EU policy on energy savings or energy efficiency were those same states that were doing most at home, but they wanted to do it in their way. And so it's a delicate path that needs to be trodden, but progress has to be made in some way. And I think it was accepted by all states that energy would be under qualified majority, and these so-called vetoes shouldn't really be given credence because they don't have a basis in law, is the point that we're making. I take your point about being careful about getting interpretations from the Court of Justice, and I leave that to better experts. But it's a tangled web that some kind of path-through needs to be found. Your question about finance, again, is very pertinent. I don't think I'm particularly qualified to answer it, so I will duck that one. But I'll do it publicly rather than just not answering it. On gas and kind of non-conventional fossil fuels, I don't think we particularly take it into account. I think it may be measured in the remaining CO2 that still exists. I can't tell you exactly whether it's broken down precisely. I think basically gas and oil, the scenarios look at the point at which they're being burnt rather than the point at which they're being extracted. The main impact will obviously be on the CO2 footprint of those fossil fuels that are used, which have a higher carbon footprint. I think the basic point is, though, that even if we only use conventional fossil fuels, those conventional fossil fuels we know exist, we're in for too much climate change anyway. If we start to look at unconventional fossil fuels like shale gas, like tar sands, we're completely lost. So the case has to be made for leaving it all in the ground, rather than just those that are harder to extract.
Okay, I first may add on the unconventional fossils. When you look at it from the climate side, it's of course clear there is enough conventional stuff in the earth to pollute, to emit enough CO2 that brings us into a really warm climate. So for that we would not need the unconventional stuff, and most of it is really dirty. I mean, tar sands, etc. That's extremely polluting. And for shale gas, we are mainly discussing whether it's better than coal or worse than coal from the CO2 or from the greenhouse gas emission point of view. So that's not really a clean thing. From that point, we should not really, it's not attractive from that point. Of course, it will play, or it did play a certain role on the energy market, particularly the US shale gas. And I would say most scenario studies available and those that we looked at are older. They did not take that into account. However, my personal view is that this shale gas had a significant effect on the short run in the US, and via that also on global gas markets, for example, in fossil markets. But I think some people overestimate the long-term effect. I don't think there is so much more shale gas, and the situation in the US will not go on forever, and I don't think that it really will be the same in Europe, for example, so that we have so much domestic gas at hand that is easily accessible, of course not clean, but brings us fossil prices into the 90s era of very low prices. I don't believe that really. That would, of course, on the politics side, make a significant difference. But I personally do think that will not happen. But that's my opinion. It's not in the scenarios, because they are basically, most of them have been created, and their assumptions because that comes in at the assumption side, are too old for the shale gas development to take that into account. But maybe back to the economic question, yes, that's of course the core issue. If I go to the scenario studies, they do not really cover that. The electricity system studies typically do not have very strong modeling into whole economy. There are no strong links, so they do not take this into account, or most of them do not really take this into account. The studies, of course, show that it is just maybe different distributions, but generally they see that electricity price is going up anyway. And if you ask these researchers, they will say, oh, electricity prices increase, regardless whether we go into the renewable or into the fossil system. Of course, that is a bit more long-term perspective than we really see in today's politics. So there is still a difference. Of course, in these days we pay for renewable energies. In Germany we have a strong discussion on this now. Just on Monday it was announced what we have to pay next year for renewable energy, and this number is subject to huge politics, and it's made up. It's only very indirectly linked to the costs of the renewable electricity. There is much more is other decisions, and it will decrease significantly, and that's fuels, of course, a strong debate, and in other countries that will be even stronger. So there's a lot of politics in this. I guess that that's a tricky issue, but it's of course a question of political will, how we are able to sell. I mean, and sometimes currently it's sold as if the renewable energy would be the reason for increasing electricity. If we believe these studies, yes, electricity prices, electricity costs will increase. But it's better to have an increase for renewable electricity. But the translation into current politics is different. So it's a quick answer, I say, but that's important to see that. If we go into models that take into account economy, they also have different, because they have different time frames, they do not have politics, they have economy in it. And they, of course, say, on the one hand, regardless which solution, both will increase prices, that will have some effects, but the main effect, the main positive effect, is on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency can save us money, can make the economy more efficient. Investment into that pay off. That's of course something different than all the renewable energies, but the energy efficiency typically in those models who do that does the positive side and pays for all the other things. And so I think energy efficiency policy really that saves electricity and not only talks about efficiency is very important and can have very strong positive effects. But all who deal with energy efficiency policy know that this is the most difficult and most slow and most delayed field in policy that we have. But when we look into the studies, that's the field where we can have strong economic gains. We also may have gains in the renewables with regards to domestic production and not importing fossil fuels, but energy efficiency is even stronger with this regards.
Adam, you want to
just add something? I thought of an answer to your second question, which actually Stefan has since said, but I did write it down before, I promise. Even if, basically the principle is even if electricity becomes more expensive, if you use less of it, you can end up saving money. There's a balance in there, but there's a potential for that. And to put a number on it, the global report that WWF did say that from 2030 you already start to save money, and by 2050 globally you could be saving $4 trillion a year. So that's not for nothing.
Thanks very much. Perfect. I think it has just brought out very much the issue that we want to bring out with this lecture series, and want to go into more detail in the coming lecture evenings. That there is this 80 to 95% reduction, political commitment, not a legal commitment, but a political commitment by the European Union at the highest level by the heads of state and government. And on the other side, you have energy policies that would need to be adapted still to trigger this, mobilize this investment that in the long term may save money, but in the short term implies a change of policy and potentially also some public money, etc. And goes to distribution of competences between the EU and member states, and how do we actually make Poland move, etc. And all interesting issues, and that's exactly that tension that we want to focus on in the lecture series, and to bring that out, because if we just don't discuss it, we will never find a solution. If at least we put it on the table and explore it, we can think about how to make progress, and that's, I think, what the speakers have tried today. Many thanks for that. These are kind of is the conclusion of the 3 introductory lectures: energy policy, climate policy, roadmap scenarios overall. We'll now go into the subsectors, into more detail. Next week, the power sector, decarbonizing the power sector, opportunities and challenges. We have Arne Mogren of the European Climate Foundation and Susanne Nies of Euroelectric. So I guess we'll hear some more. We can probably go into the role of CCS, which has changed also since these scenarios have been prepared, in the sense that CCS in the EU has not really made much progress so far. The role of nuclear, etc.
Also not making much progress.
No, I think also after some of the studies, like the German phase-out decision and things like that come into play. Great. Thanks very much to the 2 speakers. I hope we'll see most of you in the audience back for some of the future lectures, and perhaps we can conclude with a final applause for the 2 speakers. Thanks very much.